Landline now, welcome back. Our next guest is an economic sociologist who studies freight transportation, and when Steve Viscelli isn't busy with his daily job at the University of Pennsylvania, he might be writing a book or maybe taking part in a task force or working group that's looking into compensation models for the trucking industry. He is a busy man, clearly, so we won't keep him waiting any longer. Professor Steve Viscelli, thanks for joining the program.
Hey, guys. Great to be with you.
And we're also joined, I should mention, by Mark Schirmer of Landline Magazine, who has been champing at the bit here for a while to pick your brain on any number of topics. Mark, good to see you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Let's start with just everything you're currently working on, and we'll get to everything, I think, hopefully, that you're working on here. But for people who may not be familiar with your work, you've been at this. You've been studying these issues in the trucking industry for quite a long time. Can you take us back to how this all started and what your work entails specifically?
Yeah, of course. So I started looking into the trucking industry, studying the trucking industry back in 2005. And I did that by first getting a job in long-haul trucking at a big carrier. And I was interested in, what drivers thought about the conditions of the labor market. I had been, reading in graduate school about deregulation and how it affected pay and working conditions. And I wanted to see what drivers thought about that. And that started me on a long tour through, the turnover issues and then contracting. And that led into the research for my book that I published in 2016 called The Big Rig, that looked at the consequences of deregulation and how drivers, navigated the labor market and thought about the opportunities that they had and whether or not they wanted to, become owner-operators or not, issues like that. And that led to some requests from folks out in Silicon Valley to come out and talk about the work of truck drivers relative to self-driving trucks. So I have a long project on the labor impacts of that and, addressing the concerns of drivers who are particularly in rural areas, long-haul drivers whose jobs may be affected by that. So I've worked on those issues quite a bit. And now I'm also focused on package delivery and what the rise of Amazon and, this, fast, free shipping everywhere pressure that we feel now, the impact that that's having on transportation jobs.
I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of inequities when it comes to, for truck drivers out there. During your research, was there any particular kind of eye-opening moment about how many hurdles that drivers have to deal with as far as being able to actually make a good, a fair living at this occupation?
Boy, it's I'm constantly learning new things, and I'm sure your listeners do too, because things are always changing out there. And my first introduction was as a long haul driver. Went to a CDL boot camp, and and then woke up maybe a month later in a truck, middle of nowhere, waiting for my next load, and realized, holy cow, this is this is hard. And at the time, I didn't have kids. Now I have 3 kids now. At the time, I didn't have kids. But the lifestyle course and the sitting unpaid, the 21 days straight on the road, I think that was a huge eye opener. And coming into the research, I knew that the job was tough, but you don't really understand it until you do it. Since that time, I think the things that I've seen out there and that I'm sure, again, your listeners see every day, that surprised me were, a lot of the misinformation, just the gauntlet of stuff that new drivers have to navigate to get into what can be a great job, right? There are, lots of good trucking jobs left out there, but it's sometimes way too hard to get into them. And I'm always surprised when I think I've seen the bottom of the barrel, in the practices that you can encounter out there. There's always another, ace up the sleeve that somebody's got that I'm learning about. And sometimes it can be a little discouraging. You think feel like you're making progress on some things, like things are getting better in some areas, and then you see that, oh, there's a whole new problem out there that needs to be dealt with.
Let's talk about one of those problems. You speak at the bottom of the barrel. I think predatory lease purchase agreements could probably fall down there somewhere. And this is something that you're currently looking at with the Truck Leasing Task Force. And I know we'll make very clear you're not speaking on behalf of the task force. This is just your personal viewpoint and your experiences, throughout your research here. But you are a member of this task force. You are looking at the lease purchase model. Just kind of broadly speaking here, it's pretty clear from listening to everybody speak that they have identified just massive problems with this current model. Can you just tell us a little bit about where you're coming from and, how you see the lease purchase model right now in terms of how it's affecting folks out there?
Yeah, well, let me start by saying, it's a real honor and a privilege to be a part of this task force. It's a great group of people with a variety of different experience, from drivers who've been through lease purchases all the way to, folks who have owned their own trucking company and, help drivers get into trucks. So it's a wide range of experience. And of course, OOIDA has a member on there as well. And I believe, and I know many of your listeners and others, believe that these lease purchase agreements that are unfair to drivers, that drivers, really have little to no chance of completing, and really ends up being a detour on the path to becoming an owner-operator, if that's what they want to do, are a problem that actually affects all drivers out there in one way or another, by undercutting rates, by undercutting wages for, employees, and are part of this bigger issue of, driver turnover and driver supply that we often hear characterized as driver shortage. And that's one, of the problems, along with, poor training and other issues and low wages that are really undermining the foundation of good jobs in the industry. So the task force, of course, is meant to identify, these problems and then recommend solutions to that. The one thing I would say also about this process is that this is not just, those of us on the task force who are going to contribute to it. We want drivers to as well. So we were at Matt's last week, and that was great. We got to hear from some drivers, and we also have a call out for information from drivers, settlement sheets, leasing agreements, and other documents that they think might help the task force understand the scope of this problem, and then hopefully, come up with some good recommendations that can address the most predatory practices that we see out there that we know are hurting a lot of drivers.
People that defend these type of lease purchase agreements will often use phrases like entrepreneurial spirit, and that they want to help these drivers out, and they wouldn't have another opportunity if it wasn't done this way. Out of all your years of research and dealing with this, it's been talked about quite a bit on the task force. Have you, in your experience, do you know any stories of drivers actually succeeding at this, or how many have you heard that have actually succeeded from all of the ones that you've heard about?
And again, speaking just, from my own experience outside the task force,
Sure. Very,
very few. And, that's really when we have a cost benefit on these issues, it's hard to find, a significant number of drivers who have benefited from this. We do have one task force member, Tamara Brock, who made her way through a lease purchase agreement. And, the question in my mind, as in my research and talking with drivers is, even if you make it through sometimes, and of course you probably, and your listeners have heard the stories of drivers who, make it through maybe a 4-year term on a lease purchase and then go to buy out the truck only to be told that the company doesn't actually own that truck, right?
Yeah.
It's actually, they're leasing it from somebody else. And I shouldn't laugh because it's not funny, right?
No,
Yeah,
of course,
yeah,
yeah.
Make it through this. But the question is, what would the alternative have been? If those drivers had been, maybe gaining equity in a truck, in a fair lease, where would they be at the end of a 4-year lease purchase term? And my conclusion, over years of doing this and talking to hundreds of drivers, is that they would have been better off, in a different circumstance. What situation and arrangement for getting into a truck. The fact is, in order to make it through these things, drivers will make incredible sacrifices. I mean, I meet drivers who go without pay for weeks at a time, sometimes months. Living off advances from the company, living out of the truck for months at a time. Sacrificing home time with family, in order to, meet the obligations of that lease. And, of course, they get into that lease most often not understanding the full economics of it. And oftentimes you hear drivers get blamed for that. They say, well, you should know better. You should, do your homework, your research. But only that carrier really knows what those numbers look like. A driver may be shown projections of how many miles they're going to run or what the revenue of that truck is going to look like per week. And they don't have the ability to independently know, this is what I can actually expect. The carrier, of course, does. They see hundreds, sometimes thousands of these trucks leased out in a year. They know what the average revenue per week is. They know what that mileage driver can expect is. And particularly inexperienced drivers, they don't have any way to know those things ahead of time. And so they're looking out for their, the interests of their family, to try to get the best return on the tremendous effort that, people are putting in out there in the industry. And unfortunately, they're being taken advantage of far too many times.
Yeah. And we hear it all the time, and we heard that in the public comments at the Mid-America Trucking Show of the people that had just these horrific experiences, and kind of what you said there. They ended up thinking that they were getting a truck at the end of this, and ended up not getting a truck and owing a bunch of money, and it's pulling a bunch of people in. I try to, when I can, at least with things like this, look to the positive. And I think with this issue, and I know you took part in a driver compensation study, right, recently. I think that was last year. That kind of looked by the pay-by-the-mile system and all of these things that really have caused issues within the industry for drivers out there. The positive that I see, and I hope comes out of all of this, is that we are bringing these issues to light. We are talking about them, and by doing that, hopefully, we'll get to a place where we find some sort of solution for these things, whatever that may look like. Do you, and you may throw cold water on that here, I don't know, but are you, encouraged by the fact that we are talking about these things, and not only us, but regulators are looking at these issues too? Do you feel some sort of encouragement that these issues are hopefully going to be addressed, and we see and hear fewer stories like that?
I am encouraged. I think, and Todd Spencer was in the audience at Matt's, and I do believe he said, I can't believe I'm something to the effect of, I can't believe I'm actually hearing, an FMCSA task force discuss these issues, just frankly. From the time that I started, certainly, and I would say even, as recently as 7-8 years ago, we still had this, the dominance of this driver shortage narrative, for instance, that was out there. And, your program, some others might have contested it, but it was not in the mainstream media and among policymakers. It was still, running the day. And it was largely uncontested in many public debates. I think now we're seeing that we've actually seen that narrative, be pulled back a little bit, or at least the acknowledgement that, the reason that we don't have enough people is low pay and tough working conditions for most of these drivers. And another, alternatives for understanding, how predatory practices, both in training and leasing and other areas of the labor market are producing this high turnover, where far too many people, hundreds of thousands of people, according to DOT data, are coming into the industry and leaving every year because of these poor, working conditions and pay. And I think that alone and of course, lease purchase is a part of that. That alone, I think, has really shifted the public debate around these issues, and hopefully is getting to some of these would-be new drivers and also informing policy. And I do think that the compensation study that was in the infrastructure bill is a part of that, to try to look at the relationship between compensation and safety, the leasing task force, and then this push for a higher quality model of training, to do something that looks more like an apprenticeship rather than a publicly subsidized boot camp that's just going to, churn people around in 6 months, which is what we often see it in a lot of these programs. And so I am encouraged by that. I think we still have a long way to go. I've been thinking a lot about, what are those metrics that are going to show us that we're making some progress finally. We are seeing some upward pressure on wages. Now, of course, that's going to go up and down with freight volume, but I do think the long-term trends are looking like we have some leverage that drivers have in the labor market. So some are doing quite a bit better, which is good. But we have some new problems. I was just out doing interviews for that compensation study that the Transportation Research Board is heading up under the National Academy of Sciences. So I was out. I interviewed about 60 drivers about their view of compensation and what was happening. I was very surprised by the number of immigrant drivers, many of whom were not able to do the interviews in English. I think a lot of that has led to some issues where drivers may not be familiar with the rules and the law in some key areas. For instance, I met a number of drivers who were working as 1099 drivers but weren't paying for the truck. So some of that, like, well, you'll become an owner operator by paying for the truck. They're not even pretending anymore that you're going to pay for the truck. They're just paying them as 1099. I met a couple drivers who were working in cash. We're just getting a couple $100 to take loads from Chicago to LA. That sort of thing. So there is a little bit more of a Wild West feeling out there since COVID, with just some clear, and you probably heard about some of these fly-by-night companies that are just starting up and, under a motor carrier authority, disappear 2 months later after having not paid anybody. I've never met as many drivers who told me I haven't, been paid in the last couple weeks, as I did, last fall when I was out at truck stops in Illinois and then down in Texas. So I think, in the big picture on the policy side, we're getting some traction, and the debate is, more real, or at least closer to reality than it was previously. But we also have some new challenges, especially among a lot of these small fly-by-night carriers that I think are really operating outside the rules and undercutting those who are trying to do the right thing.
Yeah, and a key point I know that we all know too, that drivers are mostly paid by the mile, not for all of their time. So I think it was brought up at the last task force meeting. Someone mentioned, if you're having a hard time, making enough money, that can encourage a driver to maybe drive a little bit faster than they should to be able to get to the next load and get in as many miles in as they can under their clock. I mean, that's another aspect, right?
Yeah, I mean, we've built a system, over decades now that puts the inefficiency of the system, the cost of that inefficiency, on the driver's back, and it comes out in their paycheck. And so that we have got to get away from that mentality. Drivers have got to be fairly compensated for all the time that they work, and in my opinion, all the time that they're on the road. That's a part of the job, and as long as we continue to, make the driver bear the burden of that inefficiency, particularly as length of haul has come down, of course, that loading and unloading and waiting time, right, becomes a greater and greater portion of the day for most drivers, and we have not adapted to that. When I started researching trucking jobs, length of haul was, average length of haul was 1,000 miles. Now we're down under 500. And so that is a huge change for drivers in terms of the work that they're doing day to day. And the compensation plans and schemes have just not, kept pace with that, because companies don't want to pay for that time. They want the drivers to sit unpaid.
Yeah. You've been so generous with your time here. I did want to ask you one question while we had you, if you've got a little bit of time here, because you're painting a pretty interesting picture of where we stand right now. And to me, just looking at everything, it feels like we're entering a new era. We're kind of on the cusp of something. I don't know where we're headed necessarily, but it feels like we're headed for some sort of change. I mean, we could talk autonomous trucks. We could talk about technology, any number of things there. I'm curious, though, because you look at all of these issues and you look extensively at them. Is there anything out there that you see that you think maybe people are not paying enough attention to, something that you think is going to become a bigger story, down the line? Maybe it could be months, it could be years from now. I'm not trying to stump you here. I'm just curious because, you've got your finger on the pulse of this, and I feel like you've got a pretty good idea of, where we are. Is there anything out there that you see right now that you think, oh, that's something that's interesting? I haven't seen that before, or kind of makes you scratch your head?
Yeah, I think we are in a real transformational moment right now. I do think we're at a period that, the closest analogy might be, deregulation in 1980, right? Which led to the development of, big box supply chain, as we and most of your listeners, have spent their entire career probably working within that system now. And I think we're in the middle of a big transformation of that. We've got lots of stuff happening, whether it's reshoring and nearshoring as companies realize, the vulnerabilities of these long global supply chains stretched across, the globe to source cheap labor somewhere else, right? To autonomous trucks and electrification. So this is a ton of big, fundamental change that's happening. A lot of it can be good for trucking, and be good for truckers. My big concern is that, we're gonna the debate around these issues is going to be too narrow. That we're not going to think about the big systemic changes in policy issues that are here about infrastructure and, vehicle miles and, time on the road and all the things that are going to be affected. And of course, all that work that's going to be done, the quality of the jobs and the labor market opportunities for workers. My concern is that we're going to have a very narrow debate, which is dominated by just a few interests in there, and that, again, just like during deregulation, the voice of drivers is not going to be heard, and so at least not as much as it should. And so this is especially true around autonomous trucks. I think these are really transformative technologies. Right now, we have a logistics system that is built around the limitations of a human driver. as these, self-driving trucks roll out and start sort of stretching that geography out, changing the geography of warehousing and cross-docking and all the stuff that they're going to impact, drivers are going to feel that. And so I'm really concerned that we don't have a comprehensive debate happening around policy, the impacts of these things, and that drivers have enough of a voice in them. And I think that's really what we need to do right now, is focus on, continuing to clean up these problems, address these problems, but also look forward to, what are the jobs going to look like 10 years from now, 20 years from now? And how do we ensure that they're good jobs and that drivers don't bear the brunt of this big shift that's happening to e-commerce and then eventually self-driving trucks.
We live in interesting times. I think that can be safely said here. As I said earlier, you've been so generous with your time, Professor. We really do appreciate it. Lots of food for thought here. We'll keep an eye out for the truck leasing task force outcome. We encourage everybody to check out the big rig, trucking, and the decline of the American dream as well. Professor, thanks so much. We appreciate it.